Richard Hartwell gazed emotionlessly down at the hustle and bustle of the city from his office on the top floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. The 60-year-old real estate magnate's face was etched with the marks of long years of stress and success. However, his eyes now harbored an unease he had never known before. "Mr. Hartwell, the results are in." The door opened, and a middle-aged man in a lab coat entered. It was Dr. Anderson. Without turning around, Richard gave a slight nod. "Please, go ahead." Dr. Anderson began speaking quietly towards Richard's back. "I'm sorry. The news isn't good. The tumor has progressed more than anticipated. There are treatment options, but..." Richard half listened to the doctor's words. His mind was already filled with other thoughts. The real estate empire he had built over the years. Billions of dollars in assets. And the absence of an heir to inherit it all. "How long do I have?" Richard asked, feigning calm. "If you choose not to undergo treatment, about a year to a year and a half." For the first time, Richard turned to face the doctor. His expression was more resigned than surprised. "I understand. Thank you." After Dr. Anderson left, Richard slowly sat down in his chair. The desk was lined with various photos that told the story of his life. Himself smiling on a luxurious yacht. Photos in front of famous buildings around the world. However, not a single photo with family was present. Richard sighed deeply and picked up his mobile phone. "James, come to my office immediately." Minutes later, Richard's secretary, James Foster, entered the room. "Is there anything you need, sir?" "James, you have been my right hand for many years. The only person I truly trust," Richard began, unusually emotional. "Today, I received a terminal diagnosis from the doctor." James's face contorted in surprise. "Is there a treatment?" "There is. But that's not the issue now." Richard stood up and walked towards the window. "I have no heir. There's no one to take over this empire." James listened silently. He had witnessed Richard's lonely life up close for many years. No marriage, hardly any family interactions. The result of pouring all his time and energy into work. "James, I must resolve this issue with the time I have left. Call an estate planning expert. And I need you to dig up everything, especially personal relations from my past." "Yes, understood," James nodded. After James left the room, Richard once again stared out the window. The city's noise continued unabated, but it no longer reached his ears. His life was flashing before his eyes like a carousel. It was the moment he first realized the magnitude of what he had lost in his pursuit of success. Family, love, true happiness. All sacrificed for the empire he built. But now, there was no one to inherit that empire. Richard returned to his desk and pulled out an old album from a drawer. As he dusted it off, photos of his younger self appeared. A young man, smiling, full of hope. And next to him was, "What have I done?" Emily. Richard spoke out loud unintentionally. Emily Bloomfield. The only woman he had truly loved. However, choosing the success of his career, he had ended their relationship. For the first time, tears appeared in Richard's eyes. Success and wealth, and now, a life not much longer. Yet, there was no one to give these to, nor anyone to receive them. He was determined. He had to find the meaning of his life in the time he had left. And if possible, he had to atone for his past mistakes, even if just a little. Richard picked up his mobile phone and contacted James. James, I have another request. Find a woman named Emily Bloomfield. My former lover from over 30 years ago. James replied in surprise from the other end of the phone. After hanging up, Richard looked out the window again. The city's noise persisted. But now, a new light of hope was beginning to shine in his heart. Richard Hartwell woke up earlier than usual. The morning sun streaming through the window bathed his luxurious bedroom in golden light. However, his heart felt heavy, and he experienced a dull pain deep inside. A week had passed since the diagnosis, yet it still seemed like a dream. The bedside table was piled with documents he had been reviewing late into the night. Records of meetings with estate planning experts, a list of charities, and the investigative report on Emily Bloomfield. Richard sighed as he got up and put on his bathrobe. It was about time for his butler, Alfred, to bring breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," Alfred knocked politely before entering. "I've brought today's newspaper and your breakfast." "Thank you, Alfred," Richard responded wearily. Alfred placed the tray down and carefully unfolded the newspaper. Richard mechanically reached for his coffee, but his movement suddenly stopped. A small article in the corner of the newspaper caught his eye. Emily Bloomfield deceased. Richard's hand trembled, almost dropping the coffee cup. "Alfred, this is..." The butler noticed his master's condition and hurriedly peered at the newspaper. "Miss Bloomfield, the one James has been investigating." Richard devoured the article. Emily had died suddenly of a heart attack 3 days ago, at the age of 55. Far too young. And at the end of the article, the time and place of the funeral were listed. "Tomorrow at 2 p.m., near Central Park at a church." "Alfred, cancel all my appointments for tomorrow," Richard said, his voice trembling. "Yes, sir," Alfred replied, looking worriedly at his master. "Will you be attending the funeral?" Richard slowly nodded. "Yes. It's been over 30 years since we last met. Is it even permissible for me to suddenly appear now?" Alfred quietly answered, "It's never too late to say goodbye." At night, Richard sat alone in his study, pouring himself a whiskey. On his desk was a photo of Emily. Young, beautiful, her smile full of hope. Richard quietly spoke to the photo. "I am sorry for what I did to you. I won't ask for your forgiveness, but I just wanted to see you one more time." The next day, dressed in black morning clothes, Richard and his driver headed to the church. The air inside the car was heavy. "Sir, we have arrived," the driver's voice brought Richard back to reality. Many people had already gathered in front of the church. Richard took a deep breath and slowly got out of the car. All the faces were unfamiliar. However, he spotted a face he recognized. And Emily's sister. Despite his hesitation, Richard approached Anne. At first, Anne looked at him as if she didn't recognize who he was, but then her eyes widened. Could it be Richard? Richard quietly nodded. "It's been a long time, Anne. I'm truly sorry about Emily. It's Johnson now. I changed my surname when I got married," Anne said with a complex expression. Anger, sadness, and something else seemed to mix in her face. "I'm glad you came," Anne said quietly. "Emily, she talked about you a lot." Richard was surprised. "Really? She talked about someone like me?" And gave a slight smile. "Yes. It seems she never forgot about you until the end." Hearing this, Richard felt a pain tightening in his chest. Emily had remembered him. And yet and I can't make excuses. I was too caught up in my work and lost sight of what was important. I wanted to see Emily again. And stared intently at Richard. Richard, there's something you need to know. But now is the time to say goodbye to Emily. Can we talk a little after the funeral? Richard nodded. Yes, of course. Together, they entered the church. Emily's smiling photo was displayed on the altar. Richard quietly took his seat and closed his eyes. Emily, I'm sorry I'm late. I've finally made it here. I'm truly sorry I couldn't be with you at the end of your life. But now, a new resolution was beginning to sprout in Richard's heart. He could no longer make it up to Emily directly. However, he must do something meaningful with his remaining life, carrying the memory of her. Surely, what he wanted to talk about must be significant. The funeral began, and one after another, words celebrating Emily's life were offered. Richard quietly shed tears, listening intently to each word as if filling the 30-year void. And slowly, he began to see what he should do with his life. The solemn atmosphere of the funeral enveloped the church. Words praising Emily Bloomfield's life deeply engraved themselves in the hearts of the attendees. Richard Hartwell quietly wiped his tears in the back row of the church. After more than 30 years, he never imagined reuniting with Emily in such a manner. As the ceremony ended and people began to leave the church gradually, Ann Johnson approached Richard. Richard, may I have a moment of your time? Anne's voice carried a determination amidst the sadness. Richard quietly nodded. Of course. The two walked to a small garden beside the church. The gentle sunlight of early autumn softly illuminated the leaves of the trees beginning to turn color. Anne took a deep breath and turned to face Richard. Richard, there's something I need to tell you. It's about Emily and a secret of yours. Richard gasped. The secret? And continued quietly. After Emily broke up with you, she was pregnant. Richard's face went pale. What? Yes. Emily gave birth to a daughter. Your daughter. Richard felt as if he might collapse. He sat down on a nearby bench and held his head. Why didn't she tell me? And answered with a sad look. Emily tried to contact you several times. But you had already started a new life. She didn't want to interfere with your success. Tears overflowed from Richard's eyes. How foolish. I had the right to know. I would have taken responsibility. That's true. But to the two of you, young and immature, it seemed like the best decision at the time, and said quietly. Richard asked with a trembling voice, where is she now? And sighed deeply. Emily wasn't ready to raise a baby. Neither financially nor emotionally. So, she gave her up for adoption. Richard was stunned. Adoption? Yes. But Emily continued to think about her until the end. And chose her words carefully. Her name is Jessica. Jessica Grace. Richard was dumbfounded. Just minutes ago, he lamented having no heir. And now, he was informed of the existence of a daughter he had never known for 30 years. I have a daughter. Richard muttered to himself, as if convincing himself, and reached out her hand gently. Richard. Emily hoped until the end that you and Jessica would meet. It was written in her diary. Richard looked up and fixed his gaze on Anne. I want to meet Jessica. Do you know where she is? And shook her head apologetically. Unfortunately, we don't have detailed information either. However, the name of the agency that handled The adoption was noted among Emily's belongings. Richard stood up, his expression filled with determination. Understood. I will find Jessica, no matter how much time it takes. Richard took a deep breath. And, thank you for telling me. I may not deserve forgiveness. But with the time I have left, I want to make amends to Emily and Jessica as much as I can. Richard, the past cannot be changed. But what you do from now on is up to you, and said gently. The two quietly returned to the church. Inside Richard's heart, a whirlwind of emotions was swirling: regret, surprise, and hope. While looking at Emily's portrait one last time, Richard made a vow in his heart. Emily, I promise. I will find Jessica. And I will try to be the father you wanted me to be. This is my last chance to make amends. After leaving the church, Richard got into his car and immediately took out his mobile phone. James, I need to see you urgently. It's important. A newfound glimmer of determination was evident in Richard's eyes. A new chapter of his life was about to begin. Richard Hartwell's penthouse office overlooked the bustling streets of Manhattan. But now, the room was enveloped in silence. Richard stood in front of the large window, gazing into the distance. His eyes reflecting an unprecedented resolve. The door opened, and his secretary, James, entered. Sir, you called for me. Richard finally turned around and looked at James. James, I have an even more important task for you now. James nodded earnestly. Yes, what is it? Richard took a deep breath and began to speak slowly. I have a daughter. James's eyes widened in shock. What? Sir, that's... Yes, I didn't know until yesterday, Richard said with a wry smile. She was born 30 years ago, to Emily Bloomfield. But she was given up for adoption. James was momentarily speechless but quickly recovered. You want me to find her? Richard nodded. Yes. Her name is Jessica Grace. She should be around 30 years old now. I know the name of the agency that handled the adoption. But that's all the information we have. James took notes as he listened. Understood. I'll start the investigation immediately. However, sir, due to privacy laws, it may not be easy to obtain information. Richard sat down and sighed deeply. I understand. But do whatever you can. Use all the resources I have if necessary. Yes, I will, James nodded. Anything else? Richard suddenly stood up. Ah, yes. Prepare to amend my will. James asked in surprise, Your will? Yes, Richard's eyes were resolute. If I find Jessica, I want to make her my heir. James nodded quietly. I'll contact the lawyer. Richard turned back to the window. James, keep this matter strictly confidential. Of course, James replied seriously. I'll get started right away. After James left the room, Richard pulled out a photo of Emily from his desk drawer. Emily's smile from over 30 years ago. Emily, wait for me. I will find our daughter, Richard whispered to the photo. From that day on, Richard's life changed drastically. He managed his daily business while spending nights reading reports about the search for Jessica and planning his next steps. Contacting the adoption agency, investigating public records, hiring private detectives. He exhausted every possible avenue, but results were hard to come by. The walls of privacy were thick. And tracking down records from 30 years ago was more challenging than expected. Sir, here's the latest report. James entered Richard's office one day. We've narrowed down a few potential individuals. Richard quickly reviewed the report. Jessica Grace. 30 years old, living in New York. Yes, this person seems most likely, James continued. The timing and location of the adoption match. However, we haven't confirmed it yet. Richard pondered deeply. Should I go meet her directly? James chose his words carefully. Sir, that might be premature. Perhaps we should gather a bit more information first. Richard nodded. Yes. I don't want to alarm her by rushing. But time is limited. Just then, a dull pain coursed through Richard's chest. He grimaced involuntarily. Sir, are you all right? James asked worriedly. Richard tried to calm himself with a deep breath. Yes, I'm fine. Just a bit tired. However, his inner urgency was growing. Time was ticking away since his terminal diagnosis. Before he could meet his daughter, Richard spoke with renewed determination. Do a little more research. And think of a way to meet her as soon as possible. James nodded. Understood. Richard looked out the window again. The city's noise was constant, but his heart was storming intensely. Jessica, where are you? Dad wants to meet you. Richard's murmurs were lost to the wind swirling around the high-rise building. Unheard by anyone. Yet, his resolve grew stronger each day. The battle against time had begun. In a small apartment located slightly away from the hustle and bustle of New York City. On the third floor of an old building in room 302, Jessica Grace returned home with a weary expression and opened the door. Mommy, her 6-year-old son Ethan exclaimed as he ran up and hugged her. Jessica forced a smile and embraced her son. I'm home, Ethan. How was your day? Did you have fun at school? Yeah, it was fun. But Ethan's face clouded slightly. I got a nosebleed again. Jessica's expression tensed for a moment. Are you okay? Did it stop quickly? Ethan nodded. Yes, the teacher helped me. Relieved, Jessica stroked her son's hair. That's good. You must be hungry, right? Let's get dinner ready. As she stood in the kitchen, Jessica reflected on the day's events. She had dropped Ethan off at school in the morning, then worked as a waitress at a restaurant, and in the evening, she picked him up from the after-school program run by a local community center. On weekends, she left Ethan with Barbara, a retired teacher in the neighborhood, while she worked a part-time job as a bartender. Life as a single mother raising her son was never easy. With Ethan's medical expenses mounting, life was a struggle. However, Jessica never gave up. She believed she could endure any hardship for her son's sake. After dinner and putting Ethan to bed, Jessica headed to the small study. There, photos of her adoptive parents were displayed. Dad, Mom. Jessica whispered quietly. Her adoptive parents had faced financial difficulties when she was in middle school, and her adoptive mother had left home. Her adoptive father had raised her alone until she graduated from high school. But he passed away shortly after she started working. Staring at the photos, Jessica pondered the secret of her birth. Her adoptive parents had not hidden the fact that she was adopted. But they spoke little about her biological parents, only saying, "They loved you but weren't ready to raise you." Jessica occasionally wondered about her biological parents. Where were they now? Did they ever think of her? However, she quickly dismissed such thoughts. The immediate realities of Ethan's health and happiness were her top priorities. Meanwhile, in a penthouse office in Manhattan, Richard Hartwell listened intently to his secretary's report. Richard exhaled deeply. "Thank you, James. You've done well." "But..." James hesitated slightly. "What is it?" Richard leaned forward. "Yes. It appears that Miss Jessica has a 6-year-old son named Ethan." James chose his words carefully. "It seems he has some health issues." Richard's expression darkened. "I see." He gazed out the window and murmured quietly, "Jessica, Ethan. I have a family to reclaim." As he looked up at the moon floating in the night sky, Richard renewed his determination. The battle against time had only just begun. Weeks later, Richard found himself holding cleaning tools for the first time in his life. Wearing work clothes instead of his usual high-end suits felt unfamiliar. Standing in the hallway of Central Park Children's Hospital, he looked around. A name tag reading Robert Johnson swayed slightly on his chest. "Ready to go?" Mike, the leader of the hospital's cleaning staff, asked from beside him. Richard took a deep breath and responded, "Yes, I'll do my best." Mike clapped him on the shoulder with a smile. "Don't worry. It's tough at first, but you'll catch on quickly." Richard nodded silently. Over the past few weeks, he and James had devised a meticulous plan. By working at this hospital, where Ethan frequently visited for treatments, Richard hoped to naturally make contact with Jessica. During the first few days, Richard worked diligently, cleaning floors, replacing trash bins, and wiping windows. The tasks usually done by others were now in his hands, providing him with a new perspective. One afternoon, as Richard was cleaning the pediatric ward's hallway, he nearly stumbled and fell. Turning around, he saw a young man with a mischievous grin who had deliberately tripped him. "Oops, sorry about that." "Didn't see you there," the man sneered. Richard said nothing and attempted to continue his work when a small voice spoke up. "Are you okay?" Turning, Richard saw a boy in a wheelchair looking up at him with kind eyes. "Ah, yes. Thank you," Richard replied with a smile. The boy beamed back. "I'm Ethan. Are you new here?" Richard's heart raced. This was his grandson. "Yes, I'm Robert." "Nice to meet you, Ethan." Ethan nodded happily. "Robert, do you want to see a drawing I made?" "Of course, I'd love to," Richard replied gently. While Ethan showed him the drawing, a woman's voice called from down the hallway. "Ethan. There you are." As he turned around, a young woman was hurrying toward him. Richard's heart nearly stopped. It was Jessica. "I'm sorry," Jessica said to Richard. "Ethan, it's time for your test." Then, she noticed Richard. "Oh, you're new here. Thank you for always keeping it clean." Richard almost lost his words but managed to reply, "No, it's my pleasure." Jessica smiled kindly. "If you need anything, just let me know." Richard felt a warmth in his chest from Jessica's compassionate nature. Weeks passed, and Richard deepened his interactions with Ethan and Jessica. Ethan's brightness and bravery, Jessica's kindness and strength. Each encounter strengthened Richard's resolve. Finally, Richard decided it was time to reveal the truth. One quiet evening, Richard approached Jessica. "May I have a word with you?" Jessica looked a bit surprised, but nodded. "Yes, of course." Richard took a deep breath and began to speak slowly. "Actually, I have something I need to tell you." Then, Richard started to reveal everything. Who he was, why he was there, and what he meant to Jessica and Ethan. Jessica's expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and complex emotions. Richard also honestly discussed Ethan's illness and his own genetic responsibility. "I understand this is sudden, and I apologize for startling you. But I want to do everything I can for you both." Jessica was speechless, staring at Richard. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "I need some time. This isn't something I can accept right away." Richard nodded quietly. "Of course. I understand how you feel." That night, as Richard left the hospital, he was engulfed in complex emotions. He didn't know what would happen next after telling the truth. However, he was resolute to do everything possible for Jessica and Ethan. Days after Richard's confession, the hospital's corridors were as busy as ever, with people bustling about. However, for Richard, it felt as if the world had transformed. Jessica seemed to be avoiding him. They exchanged only awkward greetings when they met. Richard tried to give her time, but he felt increasing anxiety. One afternoon, while Richard was cleaning a hospital room, he heard Ethan's voice. "Robert." Turning around, Richard saw Ethan approaching in his wheelchair, his face bright with his usual cheerful smile. "Hello, Ethan," Richard smiled warmly. "How are you feeling today?" Ethan looked a bit tired but answered energetically. "I'm okay." "Hey, Robert. Mommy has been sad lately. Did you know?" Richard felt a pang in his heart. "Is that so?" Ethan continued earnestly. "Because you're kind, I think you can make Mommy happy. Please, make her smile." Tears welled up in Richard's eyes, touched by his grandson's pure concern. "I'll do whatever I can, Ethan." At that moment, Jessica hurried down the hallway. Her expression carried an unusual tension. "Ethan," she called out, breathless. "The results are back. The doctor wants to talk." Richard watched them go, a sense of foreboding tightening his chest. Late that night, Richard was researching the latest treatments for Ethan's condition in the hospital's archive room when Jessica entered, looking tired. "Oh." Jessica appeared slightly surprised. "You're still here." Richard stood up and asked gently. "Are you all right? How is Ethan?" Jessica sighed deeply. "Ethan's condition is worsening. The usual treatments aren't working anymore." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "Is there anything I can do?" Jessica hesitated for a moment, but then a determined look crossed her face. "Actually, there's something I want to discuss with you," she said, looking earnestly at Richard. "There's a new treatment that could save Ethan. But it's very expensive, and I can't afford it." Richard immediately responded. "Don't worry about the money. I'll cover everything." Tears appeared in Jessica's eyes. "But, we're still," Richard said firmly, yet quietly. "Jessica, you are my daughter. Ethan is my grandson. Whether you accept me or not, that doesn't change." Jessica stared at Richard, lost for words. Richard continued. "I have made irreparable mistakes. Leaving Emily and you, even unknowingly, it's a lifelong regret. But now, if there's anything I can do for Ethan, I want to do it. That's the only amends I can make." After a long silence, Jessica finally spoke. "All right. I'll accept your help, for Ethan's sake." Richard's face showed relief. "Thank you, Jessica." Just then, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A nurse was shouting, "It's an emergency. Ethan." Jessica and Richard exchanged a look and immediately rushed out. When they entered Ethan's hospital room, they found the medical staff frantically administering emergency care. Ethan lay pale, with medical devices emitting warning sounds. Jessica, on the verge of breaking down in tears, tightly gripped her son's hand. Richard, unable to hide his agitation, asked the doctor, "How is he?" The doctor responded with a grave expression, "His condition is extremely critical. He needs special treatment immediately." However, "Don't worry about the money," Richard interjected swiftly. "Whatever is needed, I'll provide it." The doctor nodded and began issuing instructions right away. Jessica looked up at Richard, tears streaming down her face, and said, "Thank you, really." Richard nodded firmly and stood by Ethan's bedside. "Hang in there, Ethan. We're all here for you." The tension in the room escalated as the staff's vigorous efforts continued. Richard and Jessica spent a long night by Ethan's side, praying for his recovery in a critical moment that tested the bonds of family. The hospital waiting room was enveloped in a heavy atmosphere. Richard and Jessica sat in silence, waiting for Ethan's surgery to finish. As the clock's hands moved slowly, the door to the operating room finally opened, and the lead surgeon appeared. "The procedure was successful," the doctor announced tiredly. "However, the next 48 hours will be critical." Jessica let out a sigh of relief and wiped her tears. "Thank you, doctor." Richard bowed his head to the doctor. "Thank you truly for providing the best treatment." The doctor looked at them both and said quietly, "Ethan is a strong boy. I believe he'll pull through." Encouraged by these words, Richard and Jessica felt a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, they took turns staying by Ethan's side. Richard handled work calls discreetly outside the room, always returning quickly to Ethan's side. Jessica, though visibly exhausted, never let go of her son's hand. On the third morning, Ethan finally opened his eyes. "Mommy," Ethan called out in a raspy voice. Jessica cried out with joy and embraced her son. "Ethan." "Oh, I'm so glad, really glad." From the corner of the room, Richard watched the scene, tears of joy appearing in his eyes. Ethan looked around and noticed Richard. "Robert, you came." Richard approached with a gentle smile. "Of course. I've been worried about you." Ethan, looking a bit puzzled, asked, "But why?" Jessica looked at Richard, took a deep breath, and explained. "Ethan, actually, Mr. Robert is a very important part of our family." Ethan's face showed surprise. "Family?" Richard began to explain quietly. "Yes, Ethan. Actually, I am your mother's father. That means I'm your grandfather." Ethan's eyes widened in astonishment. "Really?" Holding her son's hand, Jessica gently confirmed. "Yes. We only found out recently too. But Richard, your grandfather has done a lot for you." After pondering for a moment, Ethan showed a bright smile. "So, I really have a grandpa? That's amazing." Richard, overwhelmed with emotion, gently stroked Ethan's head. "That's right. From now on, I'll do whatever I can for you too." At that moment, the atmosphere in the room changed. A new bond was formed among the three of them. Over the following weeks, Ethan's recovery progressed smoothly. Richard visited the hospital daily, spending time reading books and playing games with Ethan. Jessica gradually engaged in more conversations with Richard. One day, while Ethan was napping, Jessica quietly said to Richard, "Thank you so much. Without you, Ethan." Richard shook his head gently, please don't say that. I just did what I needed to do. Besides, this is also very important to me. Jessica hesitated slightly before continuing. It might take me some time to fully accept you. But for Ethan's sake, I hope we can slowly become a family. Tears welled up in Richard's eyes. Thank you, Jessica. That's enough for me. We have plenty of time ahead of us. Outside the window, the spring sunlight shone brightly, nurturing the new family bonds forming slowly but surely within the hospital room. One chilly September day, Ethan's teacher noticed something was wrong during a gym class. Normally energetic, the boy suddenly complained of intense pain and turned pale. Ethan was rushed to the hospital. Jessica, in the middle of work, received the call and hurried to the hospital. Her eyes were already red and swollen with tears when she met Richard in the waiting room. How is Ethan? Jessica's voice trembled. Richard embraced his daughter. They're still running tests. Stay calm, Jessica. Inside, Richard was also consumed with intense anxiety. The family he had just found, the bonds they had just begun to build, were now at risk. Hours later, Dr. Carter appeared, his expression grim. Seeing his face, Jessica and Richard braced for the worst. Ms. Grace, Mr. Hartwell, Dr. Carter said, looking them both in the eye. We need to discuss Ethan's condition in detail. They were led to a quiet consultation room. Outside the window, the evening sky was stained red. Dr. Carter carefully chose his words as he began to explain. Ethan's condition has progressed far beyond our expectations. The treatments we have been using are rapidly losing their effectiveness. Jessica gasped, What do you mean? Doctor, please explain further. The antibodies forming in Ethan's body are inhibiting the effects of the usual treatments. The doctor explained. Richard furrowed his brow. Could this be due to my genetics? Dr. Carter looked at Richard intently. It's highly likely. Mr. Hartwell, does your family have a history of this type of genetic disorder? Richard's face paled as long-buried memories resurfaced. My father suffered from similar symptoms and passed away young. Jessica, looking at Richard, seemed to understand her father's deep anguish for the first time. Dad. Richard took her hand. Jessica, to think that I've caused Ethan this pain. It's not your fault, Jessica said firmly. It's not anyone's fault. Dr. Carter continued, observing their exchange. With the current treatments, it's difficult to improve Ethan's condition. We need to explore new approaches. Richard, with determination in his voice, declared, I'll do anything. Whatever it takes to save Ethan. Dr. Carter nodded. Tomorrow, I plan to convene a team of specialists to discuss Ethan's treatment in detail. We'll explain all the available options then. That night, Jessica held Ethan's hand in his hospital room. His face, usually so lively, now looked paler and thinner as he slept. Richard watched silently from a corner of the room, struggling with feelings of love for his grandson and guilt for the genetic legacy he might have passed on. In the late hours, after Jessica had fallen asleep from exhaustion, Richard quietly approached Ethan's bed. Ethan, he whispered, taking his small hand. Grandpa will do anything for you. I promise to save you, so please hang on. The next morning, the hospital's conference room was tense. Centered around Dr. Carter, hematologists, genetic treatment experts, and pediatricians gathered. Jessica and Richard were also there as Ethan's parents. Dr. Carter began, Today, we need to discuss the treatment plan for Ethan Grace. His condition is critical, and we are racing against time. The hematologist explained, the antibodies in Ethan's body are significantly reducing the effectiveness of conventional drugs. If this continues, he's at a very high risk of fatal bleeding. A genetic treatment specialist added, "We considered genetic therapy. But it would take too long for Ethan's current situation. We need a more immediate solution." As silence fell, Dr. Carter stated, "The most viable option right now seems to be a bone marrow transplant." Jessica immediately responded, "I'll donate if my bone marrow can help." However, Dr. Carter shook his head regretfully. "Mrs. Grace, I appreciate your willingness, but unfortunately, you're not a perfect match. Given Ethan's condition, we need a higher compatibility." All eyes naturally turned to Richard. Richard took a deep breath. "What about me?" "Genetically, I'm closer to Ethan." Dr. Carter confirmed, "That's correct. Mr. Hartwell, you're likely the best match." Yet, the pediatrician expressed concern, considering Mr. Hartwell's age and health. The surgery to donate bone marrow carries significant risks, especially given his existing conditions. Jessica looked at her father in surprise. "Dad, you were sick too? Why didn't you tell me?" Richard smiled apologetically at his daughter. "I didn't want to worry you, especially with everything else going on with Ethan." He addressed the doctors, "Even if it costs me my life, it's worth it to save Ethan. Please proceed with the surgery, regardless of the risks." Dr. Carter responded gravely, "Mr. Hartwell, I understand your determination. But we must consider this carefully. The surgery could significantly shorten your life." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes as she held her father's hand. "Dad, we just became a family." Richard replied gently, "Jessica, this is the only amends I can make. I want Ethan to have a happy life, and I want you to be happy too." The room was heavy with solemnity. Dr. Carter finally made the decision. "Okay. We respect Mr. Hartwell's wishes and will proceed with preparations for the bone marrow transplant. However, we will monitor both of your health statuses closely until the surgery." In the days leading up to the surgery, the hospital was filled with tension. Ethan's condition worsened by the day, and Richard underwent various tests and preparations. On the day before the surgery, the hospital corridors were bathed in the soft light of dusk. Richard had just left Dr. Carter's office, his expression a complex mix of resolve and anxiety. "Mr. Hartwell," Dr. Carter called out from behind, "if you need more time to reconsider." Richard turned and smiled, "No, doctor. My decision is firm." Dr. Carter sighed deeply, "Understood. However, given your age and health, this surgery is extremely risky. In the worst case, it could cost you your life." "I am ready," Richard replied quietly. "I am prepared to take any risk to save Ethan." On his way back to the room, Richard stopped by the window. Outside, the sunset was painting the cityscape red. He pulled a photograph from his breast pocket. It was of Emily in her younger days. "Emily," Richard spoke silently to himself. "Am I doing the right thing?" In the photo, Emily was smiling gently as she always did. Richard took a deep breath, reaffirming his resolve. When he reached Ethan's room, Jessica was reading a book beside her sleeping son. "Jessica," Richard called out softly. "Can we talk for a moment in the hallway?" Jessica looked anxious but nodded and followed her father. Outside the room, Richard looked directly into Jessica's eyes. "It's about the surgery tomorrow." "I have made my decision." Tears immediately welled up in Jessica's eyes. "Dad, to have finally become a family, and now to possibly lose you again. Richard placed his hand on her shoulder. No, Jessica. We will always be a family. Even if my body is gone, a part of me will live on in Ethan. And in your heart, too. Jessica hugged him tightly. Dad, I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't accept this sooner. That's all right, Richard soothed, patting her back. I'm the one who should be sorry for leaving you and Ethan for so long. This is my way of making amends. They embraced for a long time. Eventually, Jessica looked up, her eyes wet with tears. But, Dad. Ethan just got his grandfather. How sad he will be if you're gone. Richard smiled gently. That's why I'm going to fight to survive. I want to make many memories with Ethan, playing baseball, going fishing. Jessica nodded slightly. Promise me you'll come back. I promise, Richard answered earnestly. I will return to you and Ethan. Just then, Ethan's small voice called out from the room. Mommy? Grandpa? They exchanged a smile and walked back into the room together. Ethan was trying to sit up, rubbing his eyes. Richard gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Ethan, Grandpa is going to do something very important tomorrow to help you. Ethan looked up with big eyes. Grandpa is going to help me? Yes, Richard caressed his grandson's head. So, you need to be strong too. We're going to fight this together. Ethan squeezed Richard's hand. Okay. I'll be strong. If I'm with Grandpa, I know it'll be okay. Tears welled up again in both Richard and Jessica's eyes. The family of three drew close, sharing hope and anxiety for the coming day. On the day of the surgery, the hospital was engulfed in an unusual tension. Medical staff had been bustling around since before dawn, making preparations for the operation. At 6 a.m., Jessica arrived at Ethan's room. Her eyes, telling of a sleepless night, were weary. Good morning, Ethan, Jessica gently kissed her son's forehead. Ethan, still sleepy-eyed, looked up at his mother. Mommy, the surgery is today, right? Jessica responded firmly, yes, but don't worry. Grandpa is here with us, and we'll win this battle together. Just then, there was a knock on the door. And Richard entered the room already dressed in his surgical attire. Are you ready, Ethan? Richard smiled gently. Ethan nodded slightly. Yes, but I'm a bit scared. Richard sat beside Ethan's bed and took his small hand. It's normal to be scared. I'm scared too. But together, I feel like we can overcome anything. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. Thanks, Grandpa. Jessica watched the interaction between father and son, feeling a tightness in her chest. At 7:30 a.m., Dr. Carter and the anesthesiologist entered the room. It's about time, Dr. Carter said quietly. The nurses began to move Ethan's bed towards the surgery room. Richard was also guided to stand up by another nurse. In the hallway, Jessica hugged her father and son. Both of you, come back safely, she said. Richard kissed Jessica's cheek. I promise. Our new life is just beginning. Ethan spoke in a small voice, Mommy, wait for me. Jessica nodded, holding back tears. Of course. I'll be right here waiting. Outside the surgery room, Richard gently stroked Ethan's head. Let's meet inside. Brave knight, he said. Ethan showed a brave yet weak smile. Yeah, see you inside, brave king. They entered separate surgery rooms. Jessica was left alone in the long corridor, quietly praying. 3 hours into the surgery, the waiting room was silent. Besides Jessica, Ethan's teacher and Richard's secretary, James, were also there. No one spoke loudly, only occasional sighs and whispered prayers could be heard. Suddenly, there was a flurry of activity in and out of the operating room. Jessica stood up and approached the approaching nurse to ask a question. "What's going on?" The nurse answered apologetically. "I can't say much, but there have been some complications with Mr. Richard. However, the doctors are doing their best." Jessica felt the blood drain from her face. She leaned against the wall and took deep breaths. "Dad, please, don't give up." As time passed, the atmosphere in the waiting room grew heavier. Jessica kept getting up and sitting back down, restless. After 7 hours, Dr. Carter appeared in the waiting room looking exhausted. Jessica rushed towards him. "Doctor, how is it?" Dr. Carter took a deep breath and began slowly. "Ethan is doing well. The new bone marrow is already starting to function." Jessica sighed in relief, but her expression quickly tensed again. "And my father?" Dr. Carter's expression darkened. "Mr. Richard is still in a dangerous condition. There was too much strain on his heart during the surgery." Tears overflowed from Jessica's eyes. "But he'll be okay, right?" "My dad." "We are doing everything we can," Dr. Carter reassured her with a serious look. "Mr. Richard is fighting with remarkable willpower. I can feel his strong desire to live for his family." Jessica covered her face with her hands and started to cry quietly. Those around her silently supported her. Outside the window, the sun was setting. The long, fate-deciding day was not yet over. The fight for Richard and Ethan, and the family left behind, was still ongoing. 3 days after the surgery, weak sunlight filtered into the pediatric ward of the hospital. Ethan was still connected to many medical devices, but his complexion was significantly better than before the surgery. Jessica sat by her son's bedside, gently holding his hand. "Ethan, thank you for waking up." Ethan smiled weakly. "Mommy. How's Grandpa?" Jessica's expression briefly clouded, but she quickly smiled brightly. "Grandpa is also fighting hard. Once you're feeling better, we'll go see him together." In reality, Richard's condition was extremely critical. He was under constant surveillance in the intensive care unit. The excessive strain on his heart during the surgery had put his body in a critical state. Dr. Carter checked on Richard's condition multiple times a day. That day, he came out of the ICU looking tired. "Miss Grace," Dr. Carter approached Jessica quietly. "About Mr. Richard's condition." Jessica held her breath, waiting for his words. "He is still in a dangerous state." Dr. Carter chose his words carefully. "However, we are beginning to see signs of improvement. His willpower is truly astonishing." Jessica let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Doctor. My father is a very strong person." From that day on, Jessica's days were spent going back and forth between Ethan's and Richard's rooms. She watched over Ethan's recovery during the day and spent her nights by Richard's side. Ethan's recovery progressed faster than the doctors had expected. A week after the surgery, he was already able to get out of bed and walk short distances. "Mommy, look!" Ethan exclaimed joyfully. "I can stand by myself." Jessica hugged her son with tears in her eyes. "That's amazing, Ethan. You are such a strong boy." That night, in Richard's room, Jessica spoke to her father while holding his hand. "Dad, Ethan is doing really well. He can even stand by himself now. It must be thanks to your strong bone marrow," she smiled. "So, please wake up soon." Ethan is looking forward to seeing his grandpa. At that moment, a nurse quietly entered the room. Miss Grace, would you like to take a break? I can watch Mr. Hartwell for you. Jessica shook her head. No, thank you. I'd like to stay here a little longer. The nurse smiled kindly. Understood. But please don't overdo it. 2 weeks after the surgery, Ethan was able to move to a regular ward. His blood tests showed remarkable improvement, surprising the doctors. It's truly surprising how quickly he's recovering, Dr. Carter remarked with admiration. Ethan's body is accepting Mr. Hartwell's bone marrow very well. Ethan puffed out his chest proudly. Because it's Grandpa's bone marrow. I won't lose. Everyone in the room shared a warm smile. However, Richard's condition remained critical. He had not regained consciousness, but his vital signs were gradually stabilizing. One day, as Jessica gently stroked her father's hair, his finger twitched slightly. Dad? Jessica gasped. Dad, can you hear me? Richard's finger moved again. It was a small movement, but it was deliberate. Jessica immediately pressed the nurse call button. Doctor. Nurse. My father, he moved his finger. The medical team rushed in and began to check Richard's condition more thoroughly. Dr. Carter eventually approached Jessica with a cautious yet hopeful expression. This is a good sign. There's a high possibility that Mr. Richard is beginning to regain consciousness. From that day, Richard's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. He hadn't awakened yet, but his body's movements increased. And his vital signs further stabilized. On the 3rd week, Ethan was able to visit Richard's room for the first time. Seated in a wheelchair, pushed slowly into the room by Jessica, he softly called out. Grandpa, it's me, Ethan. Thanks to you, I've gotten better. So please, get well soon, Grandpa. When Ethan gently grasped his grandfather's hand, Richard's fingers moved slightly. Jessica and Ethan exchanged looks of surprise and joy, seeing a clear light of hope. Their new life as a family of 3 was just beginning. And their bond continued to strengthen each day. A month after the surgery, Richard gradually began to regain consciousness. At first, he only awoke for a few minutes at a time. But each day, he was conscious for longer periods. One quiet afternoon, while Jessica was reading in Richard's room, his fingers moved. When she looked up, Richard's eyes were open. Dad? Jessica gasped. Slowly moving his eyes, Richard looked at his daughter. His lips moved, and a faint voice emerged, Saika. Unable to hold back her tears, Jessica grasped her father's hand. Dad. I'm so glad, really glad. Richard weakly smiled. Ethan, is he okay? He's doing great, Jessica happily responded. Thanks to your bone marrow, he's recovering remarkably. A look of relief spread across Richard's face, but it soon turned to one of sorrow. Jessica, sorry. Jessica shook her head. No, Dad. Don't apologize. You saved us. Richard closed his eyes and took a deep breath. But, for a long time, I left you. That's in the past, Jessica gently said. What matters is now. Let's create new memories together as a family. Tears rolled down Richard's cheeks. Thank you, Jessica. A few days later, Ethan visited Richard's room. He had been discharged and was walking much better than before the surgery. Grandpa! Ethan exclaimed joyously as he ran into the room. Seeing his grandson's energetic arrival, Richard tearfully said, Ethan, it's good to see you're doing well. Ethan rushed to the bedside and took Richard's hand. "Thanks to you, Grandpa. You're my hero." Richard gently stroked Ethan's head. "Ethan, I didn't know you and your mom for a long time. I'm truly sorry." Ethan tilted his head, "But Grandpa, you helped us. Isn't that what matters?" That pure-hearted remark filled the room with warmth. Jessica placed her hand on her son's shoulder and smiled gently. "That's right, Ethan. We're here now, together. That's what's truly important." Moved deeply, Richard was at a loss for words. He looked at his grandson and daughter, feeling the warmth of a true family for the first time. "Jessica, Ethan," Richard said quietly but firmly. "Let's walk together as a family from now on. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Jessica took her father's hand, and Ethan joined in, their hands layered together. "Promise, Dad." In the weeks that followed, Richard's recovery went well. He cherished every moment with Jessica and Ethan. They made plans for the future and reminisced about old times. One day, during rehab, Ethan showed Richard a drawing he had made. It depicted the three of them holding hands. "Grandpa, this is a picture of our family," Ethan explained proudly. Richard gazed at the drawing, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Ethan, it's a wonderful picture. Let's hang it up." Watching her father and son, Jessica smiled quietly, feeling the long-held resentment and sadness towards her father melting away. That night, Jessica had a quiet conversation with Richard. "Dad," she began softly, "I finally understand. You were suffering too, all this time." Richard looked at his daughter and nodded. "Yes. Every day was filled with regret. But that's no excuse. Leaving you and Ethan was a lifetime mistake." Jessica held her father's hand. "But you came back, Dad. And you saved us. That changed everything." Tears welled up in Richard's eyes. "Jessica, thank you so much. I'm truly grateful for your strength and kindness." They embraced for a long time, feeling the years of distance fully bridged at that moment, a new bond forming between them. Outside the window, the full moon shone gently, seemingly blessing the new future of this family. Richard, Jessica, and Ethan, a new chapter in their lives was just beginning. On a calm autumn afternoon, Richard stood at the hospital's main entrance. After 3 months of hospitalization, it was finally his day of discharge. Jessica and Ethan supported him from both sides. Richard's body hadn't fully recovered yet, but his eyes held a certain light of hope. "Ready?" Jessica asked gently. Richard took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, the beginning of a new life. They left the hospital and headed to a new house in the suburbs that Richard had prepared. Ethan was dazzled by the autumn leaves visible from the car window. "Wow, so beautiful!" Ethan exclaimed joyfully. "Do we have such beautiful trees near our new home?" Richard gently stroked his grandson's head. "Ah, of course. Let's plant some lovely trees in the garden. We'll take care of them together, the three of us." As she drove, Jessica smiled through the rearview mirror at the two of them. Upon arriving at their new home, all three exclaimed in surprise. It was a beautiful 2-story house with a spacious garden. "Dad, this house." Jessica was at a loss for words. Richard smiled shyly. "I wanted us to create new memories here." Inside, the house was already furnished, emanating a warm atmosphere. On the living room wall hung Ethan's drawing of the family, made during his hospital stay. Ethan ran excitedly around the house. "Where's my room?" Probably upstairs, Jessica called out as she chased after her son. But don't run. Richard sat on the sofa, watching this scene with tears of happiness in his eyes. That night, they had their first family dinner in the new house. Jessica's homemade dishes lined the table. "This looks delicious," their voices harmonized. Mid-meal, Richard spoke up quietly. "Jessica, Ethan. There's something I want to say." The two stopped eating and looked at him. "I've been so absorbed in my work for many years, I lost sight of what truly matters." Richard continued seriously. "But meeting you, and after that surgery, I finally understood. Family is the most important thing." Tears appeared in Jessica's eyes. Ethan, slightly confused, listened intently to his grandfather. "From now on," Richard went on, "I want to cherish every day with you and make up for lost time." Jessica took her father's hand. "Dad, we feel the same way. Let's walk this path together as a family from now on." Ethan joined in, and they all stacked their hands together. "Promise," Ethan said energetically. In the days that followed, their lives were filled with new memories. They enjoyed picnics in the park on weekends and cheered together at Ethan's baseball games. Richard taught his grandson how to fish and they built model airplanes together. Jessica felt her complex feelings towards her father healing gradually in their warm daily life. One evening, while having a barbecue in the garden, they spent a peaceful time together. Ethan ran around energetically, and Jessica and Richard watched him with smiles. "Dad," Jessica said quietly, "thank you for giving us this happiness." Richard hugged his daughter gently. "No, Jessica. I am the one who is thankful. You and Ethan have taught me the true meaning of life." Ethan ran over to them. "Hey, let's go to the zoo next weekend." Richard lifted his grandson and answered with a smile. "Of course, my boy. Let's all go together as a family." As the sun set, the three huddled close together. They had overcome past pains and regrets, now bound by love and ties that were just beginning. In his heart, Richard spoke to Emily. "Emily, if you're watching, see how happy our daughter and grandson are. I've finally fulfilled your wish." The first star began to shine in the sky, blessing the dawn of their new life. Richard, Jessica, Ethan. Their smiles gently echoed through the twilight garden. The sound of true happiness found after long hardship.